Welcome back, everybody. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Walter Scheirer from Notre Dame in Indiana. Going to give a talk central to our another expression of one of our themes at Guardians, which is how do we tell the difference between what's real and what's fake? How do we tell the difference between information that gets published that is authentic versus fabricated? So please, Walter, very much looking forward to your talk.
Great, thank you for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here today to tell all of you a little bit about the history of photographic manipulation. So in terms of my scientific work, I have for a number of years been conducting research related to the area of media forensics. This is about information integrity, specifically looking at the potential of images and videos having been tampered with in some capacity, and also synthetic media being able to detect that. The applications of that have spanned everything from photos that have been posted to social media to scientific integrity, which of course this conference is very much interested in. This question of whether or not images in the scientific literature have been manipulated in some way, in some inappropriate way. With all of that in mind, a few years ago, I got interested in the question of the history of all of this. Was this something new? When was the first image faked, right? There are a lot of interesting questions that come about when you start to think about what it means to have a visual representation of something and what is its relationship to the physical world. So what I'm going to talk about today is basically the history of photographic manipulation going all the way back to the invention of the camera in the 19th century. And I think this will be really interesting. I'm going to try to put it into a social context and touch on some various issues that this workshop is very interested in, so I gather. So let's jump into it. Let's see. Oops, if my slides would advance. There we go. So let me start by talking a little bit about the internet and posing this question to begin with. Why is there so much fake stuff on the internet? That there is fake stuff on the internet should be a surprise to nobody at this point. The internet is awash in all sorts of troubling material, to say the least. We have political conspiracy theories, which have led to violent action in the physical world, right? Recall the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. During the pandemic, right, we've seen the rise of movements that have impacted public health, for instance, the anti-vax movement. And of course, a tremendous amount of political material containing images that have been manipulated in some way. Right, so there's all of this fake stuff circulating out there in the internet ecosystem, propelled by social media, which of course everyone on the globe is now connected to. And since these are stories that are generating social problems, it's worth asking, why is this coming about and what can we do about it? A few years ago, New York Magazine looked into this matter and asked the question, how much fake stuff is out there? They determined that less than 60% of all web traffic is human. The bulk of users on social media platforms are bots, and the veracity of most of the content people are consuming is in question. The internet, in some sense, can't really be trusted by the average person, because what they're viewing, right, is part of some fictional universe in many cases. And of course, the prevailing concern over the past several years has been the rise of the so-called deep fake. Deep fakes are videos that are either purely synthetic or have taken a real video and modified it in some way, such that whatever message is being delivered by the subject in that video has been altered. So you're seeing synthetic audio being added to these videos, faces being reanimated such that the delivery is more naturalistic, all these different things. And in the beginning, they were a bit crude, but over the years, they've become more sophisticated and a bit more plausible. And the concern, of course, is that eventually one will appear that is so compelling, people will believe whatever the false information is. Here's just a small example some of you may have seen last year. There was a deep fake that appeared shortly after the most recent Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky appeared to be capitulating. In this video, he basically tells the armed forces of Ukraine to stand down, that he is giving up in the face of such tremendous Russian military presence invading his country. Now, of course, all of this was completely fake. And what's interesting about this, again, a lot of people pointed to it as a very dangerous political artifact, but it had basically no impact on the conflict. There was tremendous amount of information to the contrary. Zelensky was still in charge of the Ukrainian armed forces. They did not receive any order from him, any direct order telling them to stand down. The country, right, was proceeding with its defensive preparations without any interference from this particular video. Yet this idea persists that the content will get better and better, and the perfect fake will revise history, perhaps in some way, leading to grievous consequences. What I think that was a little bit more interesting when you think about the impact that fake media has on the public and where it does lead to actions in the physical world. The content that is obviously fake. Now, this may seem a little bit surprising, but as we turn to the history of manipulated media, we'll see that this is a long-standing issue. For instance, complicated meme universes, right? Of course, memes are obviously manipulated imagery, right? Sometimes they're purely cartoonish. In other cases, right, you're blending elements of illustration and real photography, or these mashups of real photography, etc. These are traded widely, and again, most of them are innocent jokes, but some of them, right, are deeply political. For instance, right, when we think about the origin of the pandemic, there was a tremendous amount of meme activity, especially in the early days, as people tried to explain what was going on. So in the upper left of this slide, you see this steaming bowl of bat soup. Of course, there was a myth circulating that the pandemic started when somebody in China ate a bowl of bat soup. Now, it turns out that is not a dish that is served in China. This was basically a racist urban legend that had been circulating, but people were starting to believe it. And they were generating content that was, in fact, quite a bit racist. For instance, if you scrutinize this image, the face of the bat may look a little bit familiar. It turns out this is a Pepe the Frog meme, and of course, Pepe the Frog has been associated with far-right humor in the United States and elsewhere. And that's just part of, again, this larger ecosystem of conspiracies that, again, are sort of used by people to explain complicated situations, but are false, right? For instance, right, the COVID 5G bioweapon diagram here, right? It's this intricate conspiracy chart. These are elaborate stories that, again, have troubling aspects in many cases, especially when they're tied to racist ideas, to ascientific ideas, things that undermine public health and undermine the sort of conduct of civil society. But again, what's interesting about this, it's not like the deep fake case. These are things that are obviously not legitimate media, yet they resonate quite heavily with the public. And this is a phenomenon I've been calling lately restyling reality through the use of creative technologies, some being backed by sophisticated AI algorithms. It's possible to take elements from the physical world that are sampled, right, like photos and videos, and on the fly transform them, right? In some cases, again, this is purely innocent, like these Chinese makeup and fashion apps. In other cases, it starts to bleed into politics. For instance, this meme from the conflict in the Donbass, which predated the most recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is a soldier in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine who has been memeified. His face has been replaced with a Wojak meme. Wojak symbolizes melancholy. This is kind of commenting on the bleak nature of the conflict at that point, right? Wojak is associated with phrases like "feels bad, man." And so again, it starts to take elements from the real world, placing them into these broader stories associated with larger conspiracy networks. But again, this content is very, very popular. Why is that the case? Why is this stuff that is obviously fake resonating much more deeply than the more plausible looking fakes? Another question you can ask is, should we just ban all of this stuff, right? I mean, again, should fake stuff exist on the internet in any capacity? This has been a long-standing question when we think about the interface between creative technologies and a space like the internet, which was at one point envisioned as being sort of a database of facts. So maybe a reflection on photography itself is warranted. This is something, again, I haven't seen a lot of writing on in terms of the role of photography as a creative medium and what license people have had in years past to change these photographs in any way they saw fit. What was the technology like, and in what capacity was the manipulated media used? This is something that I think is really, really interested to dig into when we think about the internet today. So let me give you first a very brief history of photographic propaganda. Let's begin with Mao in China back in the mid-20th century. Here's a really interesting quote from some of Mao's revolutionary writing. "If you want knowledge, you must take part in the practice of changing reality." Revolutionary movements like Maoism were very intrigued with this idea. You could, as a person, an autonomous agent, make changes to the world around you, which could influence the actions of others. And of course, in the 20th century, we see the rise of the media as being an extremely important mechanism for sending messages that can influence people's behavior. For instance, right, we have the rise of mass print media, we have the rise of radio, we have the rise of television, and of course, the photograph and later digital videos and digital photographs, right? All of this is happening in the 20th century as time goes on. Mao is savvy and he realizes that the media is going to be a big piece of the revolution in China and of course elsewhere. And so that meant from early on, Maoist China was very interested in manipulating photographs depending on the political circumstances of the time. So here is a really interesting artifact from the 1970s. These are two different versions of a photograph depicting Mao's own funeral. On the bottom is the original photograph. You can see, right, some people have been removed in the revised photo on the top. Now, what's really fascinating about this revision is that there are these gaps left in the photograph. Now, you may be thinking, wait a minute, this is film photography. It's probably really hard to do that. Folks back in the 1970s didn't have access to advanced AI technology. They didn't have Photoshop. So this is probably the best they could have done. Well, it turns out that's not the case at all. As we'll learn in a few moments, it was quite easy to fill in gaps in photographs. In this case, the censors in China have chosen to leave these large gaps in the photograph. Now, who is missing, you may be thinking? The group that is missing was known as the Gang of Four. They were four very high-level officials in China, in the Chinese government at this time, and four people who were singled out after Mao died as being sort of complicit in the excesses of the Cultural Revolution, which had a tremendously bad impact on Chinese society in the 60s into the early 1970s. And so they were quickly thrown into prison and for what had happened. Now, it's interesting that group included Mao's own wife. Now, again, if you look at this photograph and you were familiar with Chinese politics at the time, you would have realized that these people were missing, right? They would have obviously been there at the very front of the funeral proceedings, but they're gone. So what's happening here is the Chinese censors are trying to send an intentional message to the population of China. And also, again, this was published for a global audience as well. If you make any missteps, you can disappear too. So again, not really this older idea of the perfect fake. They were trying to revise history in a plausible manner. This was meant to be an obvious change that people would recognize right away and then get the message. Now, the idea of the perfect fake, though, persists, particularly in America, and especially within the national security community here in America. There's a really interesting book I recommend if you're interested in this kind of thing by the French journalist Alain Jabert called Making People Disappear, an amazing chronicle of photographic deception. It talks about different authoritarian regimes that have been in the business of changing photographs. So this is fascist Italy, this is the Third Reich, this is Maoist China, this is the Soviet Union, right? All of the usual suspects. And there's a really interesting preface to this book by the national security figure in the US, Roy Godson. He writes the following: Scheirer points out that the systematic faking or falsification of history are encountered anywhere a serious effort is made to copy the methods of totalitarian propaganda characterized by its three major styles: fascist, Nazi, and communist. The falsification of photographs comes easily to those governments and elites that seek to be the sole interpreters of history and have a monopoly on the information media, right? So intelligence analysts in the US would look at these photographs and believe that the intention was that the viewer was supposed to believe that this is what happened at this moment in time, right? That this was some true reflection of the circumstances, but a revised interpretation of what had happened. This continues this idea. We look at, say, the popular media. For instance, Michael Crichton's novel from 1992, Rising Sun, which is a crime thriller, and it talks about a criminal proceeding, an investigation, and a court trial where photographic manipulation comes into play. In this book, discussing this matter of the perfect fake, one of the characters says the following: "The case law isn't entirely clear, but it's coming. All photographs are suspect these days because now, with digital systems, they can be changed perfectly." So this idea becomes even more intriguing after the digital camera is invented in the late 1970s and becomes a consumer product in the 90s. Now, through the use of computers, it's becoming easier to manipulate photographs, and the danger of the perfect fake becomes far more salient. Now, of course, Michael Crichton is very famous for his speculative fiction, right? Thinking about the unanticipated uses of new technology. This one he singles out as being particularly troubling for the court system. Okay, so what about the fundamental question at hand here? What is the truth? The documentarian Errol Morris, who's really famous for all sorts of really interesting films over his career, looking at some of these deeper questions about truth and meaning, looked at the photograph in a series of essays he published in the New York Times about 15 years ago. He had this to say in one of these essays about the truth values that we could associate with a photograph. "The idea that photographs hand us an objective piece of reality, that they by themselves provide us with the truth, is an idea that has been with us since the beginnings of photography. But photographs are neither true nor false in and of themselves. They are only true or false with respect to statements that we make about them or the questions that we might ask of them." So what Morris is pointing out here is that the photograph has never been a snapshot of some objective truth. The photograph in some sense is a social object that can be interrogated. It has a context, right? And it has a history. And that history is really interesting because, again, there could have been some manipulation behind the scenes. For instance, Morris is really interested in the arrangement of objects in photographs. We know, looking at the history of photography, that various photographers have staged their photographs, right? They've altered the scene in some way before capturing that moment, and then you wonder, is that a true reflection of what is happening at that moment, at that point in time, in whatever location the photograph was taken? And then, of course, right, you could extend that all the way to photographic manipulation. But what Morris points out is the story is just very complicated because, again, the photograph isn't a complete picture. So that's somewhat troubling. Can we ever determine the truth of anything if we can't use something as rigorous, perhaps, as a piece of photographic evidence because of all of this? Well, the philosopher Hannah Arendt considered this question in the mid-20th century and in the context of her own work studying totalitarian regimes. This is what she had to say about the truth in terms of what it is. "Conceptually, we may call the truth what we cannot change. Metaphorically, it is the ground on which we stand and the sky that stretches above us." This is actually some reassuring material when we think about trying to figure out what the truth is. For instance, coming back to that deep fake of the Ukrainian President Zelensky, there was so much other evidence that was so obvious to so many people. Of course, the deep fake didn't work, right? Because in some sense, it can't overturn what truly is the truth, right? This observable evidence that so many people are experiencing at the same time, and you build this overwhelming consensus. This is what we've seen time and time again when someone has tried to create the perfect fake and revise history. So that doesn't work. But what does seem to work, as I pointed out, the things that are obviously fake, because this type of analysis no longer works. And that's why I think the obvious fakes have been far more popular over time, which takes us now to the history of photographic manipulation in the era of film photography. This is where things get really interesting. So we typically don't think of the early camera as being something that is easily malleable, but it turns out from the very beginning it was. So here in front of you is the first fake photograph ever produced, Self-Portrait as a Drowned Man. It appears in 1840, and remarkably, it is produced by one of the inventors of the camera. And it has an interesting backstory. So Hippolyte Bayard, who is a French inventor, is the subject who is depicted here. He's faking his own death in this photograph. And he produces this photograph as a form of protest. And what I find so fascinating about this photograph, it seems to be drawn from the internet, right? When we think about fake things circulating on the internet, especially if you're familiar with like memes associated with text posts on social media, sites like 4chan, you see a lot of this type of material. You have, again, a strange or whimsical image, and it's paired with a little story. And of course, the story is fictional. But Bayard seems to have pioneered this in the 1840s. And he has a beef, as it turns out, with the nascent industry of photography. He feels that he's being slighted as an inventor because a competing process is winning out over his own, particularly the daguerreotype. So he pens this little story and circulates it with his fake photograph. The corpse which you see here is that of Monsieur Bayard, inventor of the process that you have just seen, or the marvelous results of which you are soon going to see. To my knowledge, this ingenious and indefatigable researcher has been working for about 3 years to perfect his invention. The Academy, the King, and all those who have seen his pictures that he himself found imperfect have admired them as you do at this moment. This has brought him much honor, but has not yielded him a single farthing. The government, having given too much to Monsieur Daguerre, said it could do nothing for Monsieur Bayard, and the unhappy man drowned himself. Oh, the fickleness of human affairs. Artists, scholars, journalists were occupied with him for a long time, but here he has been at the morgue for several days, and no one has recognized or claimed him. Ladies and gentlemen, you'd better pass along for fear of offending your sense of smell, for as you can observe, the face and hands of the gentleman are beginning to decay. So this is way over the top, right? This is like clearly like satirical humor, but again, very representative of the same type of humor that circulates in the meme world today. So really, really interesting to see that early. And that's just the beginning. As photography becomes a business, part of that business is photo retouching. Obviously, you have a lot of flexibility in any creative medium. The film camera is no exception. And very early on, photographers realized it wasn't that difficult to make some basic changes to images. And then as time goes on, they create more elaborate editing procedures. But the basic process is as follows. So here on this slide, you see what is known as a retouching desk. If you know anything about old film photography, you know probably that it's an inverse process. So the film itself, right, is an inverse of the world. So regions that appear very dark on the negative, right, on the film, that will appear very light when the photograph is developed, and vice versa. So that meant if you wanted to, say, lighten up somebody's complexion, retouch their face, all you have to do is apply a little bit of ink to the photograph. If you wanted to darken up part of an image, you would scrape off some of the dark areas using what is known as an etching knife. And so this became standard operating procedure. When you'd sit for a photograph, you could order whatever effects you wanted, whatever the photo studio was able to do behind the scenes in the dark room, right? And people would pay for these services. This is how this was done before Photoshop. So you can see some examples here that are really interesting. On the left, again, is just someone who sat for a professional portrait. The original image is on the left, right? So you can see this woman wanted her face to appear a bit brighter, smooth out the blemishes. And so some ink was applied to the negative, and then you see the photo on the right of the original showing, right, how her complexion has improved. Again, very basic thing you would simply order when you got your portraits taken. The example next to that one is a bit more interesting because it has a political backstory. The subject in the center of the group photograph is one of the mutineers from the battleship Potemkin, right? So this is a famous episode in revolutionary Russia. There was a mutiny on this ship, right? And it was seen as a heroic revolutionary act on the part of the mutineers. And so this is the lead mutineer. He was a man from Ukraine who had fairly ethnic-looking features. He did not look very European. He looked more Asian. In the Soviet textbooks, they went back and cleaned up his appearance such that he looked more European. Right? This is, again, a form of propaganda. And something we see today when we look at various apps designed to change our faces in some way. Again, I mentioned this concept of restyling reality. One can download apps now that can change our ethnicity on the fly, right? This is the same concept. It was just a bit more labor to do it back in the era of film photography. Cropping was a very basic operation that could drastically change the interpretation of a scene, as it turns out. This is what we now know as kind of a cheap fake. We see this a lot with digital imagery, but again, it was very easy to do. In film photography, you simply have to just cut the photograph. Here's an example, again, drawn from Maoist China. Mao is the subject in the center of this photograph. You can see that there is another official who is ahead of him as they're reviewing these military personnel on an airfield. The Chinese censors much later on decided to revise this photograph such that Mao would be in the lead. In fact, they were revising many photographs such that Mao was always in the lead. Now again, a reasonable person wouldn't always believe that Mao, right, in every single circumstance in life was always at the front of some group. But again, this was meant to build a sort of cult of personality around one particular person, not necessarily, again, to definitively revise the historical record. Face swapping, again, something we're really interested in when we think about deep fakes. This is nothing new. This is a particularly hilarious example of face swapping because it's not very good, and I think that's why this photograph has persisted for so long. This is the USA hockey team from the early 1960s, which went on to Olympic glory, defeating the Soviet Union in a great moment in sports history. It turns out when the team originally sat for this photograph, some of the members were absent. And so after the big Olympic victory, somebody went back and pasted the heads of those missing players on top of some other players that had made it to the session. And again, you can see like the lighting is inconsistent, some of the sizes are off. And again, people thought this was like really, really funny, right? So this photograph was immensely popular. Again, sort of resonating with the absurdity of internet humor just in an earlier era. I kind of wonder about the feelings of those players, right, who were also on this team, who had their faces removed and replaced by these mismatched heads. Props, another basic thing you could do. As I mentioned, right, Errol Morris was really interested in like moving objects around photographs. Someone realized along the way that, hey, you can add fantastic elements to photographs by just including some props. The elderly gentleman on the left here is the poet Walt Whitman. Whitman was kind of a proto-influencer back in the 19th century. He was very much in the news all of the time. He was a relentless self-promoter, always trying to sell his volumes of poetry. This is a photograph that was included in the jacket for an early edition of Leaves of Grass. It appears to show Whitman interacting with a butterfly that has landed on his finger. It turns out that is a prop butterfly that is connected to his finger via a wire. But Whitman would claim, right, he had this almost supernatural ability to interface with nature. And this photograph was meant to sort of justify that claim. On the right is another famous fake photograph from a series known as the Cottingley Fairies. In the early 20th century, there were two young cousins living in the British countryside, and they produced a series of photographs that were quite remarkable. They appeared to show these two young girls with fairies in the woods. They claimed that they would go out on walks and the fairies would come to greet them as they passed through various parts of the property they lived on. And they happened to have a camera with them to capture each of these moments. There was intense speculation in the early 20th century as to whether or not these photographs were legitimate. Was this proof that fairies existed? Remarkably, these photographs had staunch defenders, such as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock Holmes books. He was a noted spiritualist and was absolutely convinced of the veracity of these photographs. Really interesting, since we think of those books as being sort of the pinnacle of rational thought, right? You know, Holmes like works through in the most rational way all these different crimes, piecing all the evidence together, always sort of, you know, coming to the right conclusion. But Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself, right, was really interested in things such as the supernatural. Turns out, again, this is all fake. These were cardboard cutouts, and one of the cousins in the 1960s finally admitted that it was all a hoax. Photo montage is eventually developed, and as I pointed out, it's not that difficult to do to make a composition photograph in the film era photography. That's why, again, looking back at some of those propaganda photos, it becomes more clear that these were intentional messages versus just really a difficult editing job that nobody could accomplish. That said, the more outrageous photo montages are the ones that really resonated with the public. For instance, in the early 20th century here in America, it was very popular to create postcards with overemphasized objects promoting whatever a particular region was growing or catching. For instance, the giant corn one could enjoy in Wisconsin, or right at this lakefront, the giant fish you could catch that might sink your boat if you could actually get them into the boat. These things to this day are still pretty collectible, and there's just many thousands of variations on this. And again, if you look at them, they basically look like today's memes. Again, there's something about this form of humor that really resonates with people. This has not gone away. And then my absolute favorite, double exposure photography, sometimes known as old spirit photography. In the late 19th century, a very clever photographer realized that if you took a photo and then exposed the negative to light again, you could get a second photograph on the same negative. But the second exposure wouldn't be as crisp as the first, right? It would lose some fidelity. And you would end up with these ghost-like looking objects on the negative. And when you develop it, right, it definitely looked like there was some spirit lurking in the background. So what this ended up being then was a really interesting way to sit for a photograph and include your long lost loved ones. So here are two examples. You could sit down, right, with your deceased wife, with a deceased child. This became extremely popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Again, it just was added to the catalog of special effects. Okay, so there's a long history of photographic editing going all the way back to the invention of the film camera in the mid-19th century. This does not stop, obviously, as we get to the early era of digital photography. In fact, now more possibilities are opened up by the power of the computer. So in 1988, you see the appearance of the so-called digital darkroom. Gerard Holtzman publishes a book he calls Beyond Photography this year. Holtzman is an engineer working at Bell Labs and is really interested in this new technology that has appeared, the digital camera. And he's wondering, instead of doing just the darkroom manipulations, can you go beyond that using all sorts of interesting nonlinear transformations that are now available on a digital computer? So he goes and first implements the things that were popular in the darkroom, right? For instance, blurring for retouching, image splicing, right? That's pretty basic stuff, but the effects are pretty good. In some cases, can be a bit better and can be executed quicker than in the darkroom. But he goes beyond that to develop techniques for head shrinking, artistic stylization of photographs. I think this one's really interesting because it's extremely popular today. And that's something that you simply could not do in a darkroom. And even corporate logoization. He figures out a transformation to take anybody's head and convert it into the AT&T Death Star logo. He's, of course, right, he worked at the phone company. He was at Bell Labs. This is a really fascinating book, especially if you're interested in like computer history. A lot of the subjects he uses are famous programmers from that era, the original Unix team, etc. I think that's Rob Pike in panel A, if you know anything about programming. Or these are big figures, which is interesting. And he releases a software package for the Unix operating system that can perform these operations, right? So now it's just a matter of setting up your home computer to do it, because Unix was not accessible to the average person back then, right? So this is kind of high end. But also in this year, 1988, there's a different team working on a different piece of software that is meant for the average consumer. And this, of course, is Photoshop. Photoshop, the story behind it's really fascinating. It was originally written by two brothers from Michigan, John and Tom Knoll. John Knoll in the 80s was working for Industrial Light and Magic, right, a special effects shop in Hollywood. Was really interested in what the computer could do for special effects. His brother Tom Knoll was pursuing a PhD at the University of Michigan and was really interested in just the hobby of photography. His PhD, in fact, related to digital imaging, especially like higher end digital imaging technologies that were emerging at that time. However, he sort of loses interest in his PhD after a period because his obsession with this personal project becomes overwhelming. So what they end up doing is creating basically what Holtzman had in terms of this suite of different manipulation techniques, but they build a really nice graphical user interface around it that anybody can use. They build the right interfaces for talking to the digital camera, for storing the files, exchanging those files, and most crucially, developing a plugin interface such that other programmers could create new effects and just seamlessly plug them into the Photoshop application. Here are some images from the original Photoshop demo that John Knoll would present to various tech executives because we're trying to commercialize this product, realizing that it would be commercially valuable. What he did was take this high-resolution digital image of his wife topless in Bora Bora, and he would clone her and make the argument that this new software had the ability to replicate beauty. And this, in the rather male, masculine world of technology, resonated quite strongly. And Adobe quickly jumps up and says, we'll acquire the whole thing, right? And the rest is history. Adobe to this day is still selling this product, which is almost synonymous with the act of photo editing itself, right? When we talk about manipulation, especially in a negative context, right, we're always talking about photoshopping. And it's amazing, again, what these two brothers were able to do as early as 1988 with this software. The field of media forensics starts to develop in the 1990s. And remarkably itself, it starts to generate new manipulation techniques, which we see today. For instance, text overlay editing, which is very popular as memes are remixed over time. This appears in a forensics paper from 1998. The deletion of objects becomes more sophisticated as techniques from signal processing and computer graphics are integrated into the process. This is just showing an example of the deletion of a stool, noting this type of forgery from a PhD supervised PhD dissertation that was supervised by Hani Farid, who's one of the leading figures in the area of digital forensics. Again, trying to point out that these techniques are getting better. You can do things like a perfect fake in real time. It doesn't require a lot of skill anymore because we've automated the process. Face swapping gets increasingly better. We've come a long way from the hockey photo I showed you, right, from the 1960s. Again, through the use of techniques using computer vision and computer graphics, we're able to do this in a more plausible manner. And then finally, you get to the point where there's this intersection between amateur communities on the internet, memes, and these very sophisticated photo manipulation tools. I think the best early example of this phenomenon is this photograph on the left, the so-called 9/11 tourist sky photo. And maybe you've seen this before. This is an incredibly popular, like early viral image that's circulated on the internet. You can see the image, the original image on the left. There is this man. He appears to be standing on the top of a skyscraper, and there is a plane barreling at him from behind. and he is not aware of what's going on here. Now, what's really fascinating about this photograph, like the photograph of Bayard from 1840, it too contained a story. And this is before social media, so this would circulate via email chains. The photograph would be an attachment. The body of the email explained where this photograph came from. Because if you think about it, it was like, wait a minute, if the tower was destroyed, where did this photograph come from? The story made the claim that hours after one of the towers had collapsed, there's a first responder digging through the rubble, and he recovers the tourist's camera. And he's intrigued. So after he gets back home, he develops the film that was in this camera, and this photograph comes out, right? This chilling final moment of this man. Now, there was intense speculation as to whether or not this photograph was real for many months. People were debating it on the internet. And eventually, the subject, right, the tourist, appears and says, hey, I'm still alive. It was all a hoax. I just used a computer to make this image. But at that point, the meme had gained a life of its own, and it was being remixed over and over again. This meme trope would involve taking the tourist guy and putting him into other disasters, both real and imagined. For instance, the Challenger space shuttle exploding, King Kong, etc. Now, what's interesting about this case, in terms of thinking about the debates we're having today about such content, there were camps that were very much against this type of thing, right? Where it's like, this is not funny. This is a very serious event. We should not be making light of the tragedy of 9/11, and we shouldn't be fooling people about tragic events. There was another camp that said Black humor has always existed, right? People are able to deal with their emotions better when they think about jokes, right, that are associated with serious events. And this is just yet another example in a long history of that sort of humor. And of course, the debate was never resolved. So that takes us then to the present day, the frontier of the imagination, where we see things like this all of the time. A bit about the internet in terms of its current state and thinking about it in the past. As I mentioned earlier, there is this notion of the internet as something like an information superhighway, right? Remember that cliche from the 1990s. Back then, it was believed that the internet should be a database of facts, right? It's something that we're going to use for education. It's something that we're going to use for commerce. Very serious things will happen there, right? It shouldn't be a place for fun and games. An ad from this era kind of gives you the sense of this. So this is an IBM ad that appeared in the 90s during the internet boom. Wander through a distant library. Turn your corner store into a multinational. Curious? IBM can get you there, right? This is not a place for fiction, right? It's a place for serious business. That, of course, was not the original vision, though, of the infrastructure that would become the internet. Turning back to the 1960s, you find a lot of work in the area of mass communications talking about emerging information networks and what they would do in the future, specifically what role they would serve for culture. Most famous out of all the commentators in that area, of course, is Marshall McLuhan. McLuhan believes that information networks will generate something like a cultural renaissance throughout the entire world. He's very upbeat about the prospect of storytelling on these networks, arguing that they are in some sense an extension of the imagination. You can project your most imaginative ideas into the information network, and everyone on the planet will be able to experience that. And he argues this will be almost like a visceral experience, right? You can feel what other people are thinking. If you can instantiate this through technology, it's a huge win. He says this is, electric circuitry that will be an extension of the central nervous system. And for many years, he's arguing for this idea. And that's basically the internet we end up with. Of course, right, technologists were paying attention to McLuhan because he's very, very optimistic about the potential for information networks. And they go on to build basically what he is describing in the 60s and 70s. And this is, of course, the internet that everybody seems to love. We can do anything on the internet, right? Because we can do more there than what we can do in the physical world, thanks to these new creative technologies. And so again, you start to see these meme communities appear, right, where they're faking everything and everything. For instance, Something Awful's Photoshop Fridays feature from the early 2000s, again, the sort of proto social media era. You can change history in outrageous ways, right? Forget about the perfect fake. Let's put RoboCop behind JFK as he's delivering a speech to Congress. Let's fabricate record albums, right? Here is, right, a Kraftwerk Christmas album that has never been produced. Again, it's just in somebody's imagination. Thomas Kincaid, you can create fictionalized versions of his paintings, right, to parody his sort of idyllic scenes, showing death, destruction, mayhem, right? All of this was very, very popular, right? So you could take, again, the current cultural milieu and modify it as you saw fit. This continues on. Reddit's Photoshop battles is basically, right, a similar community where, again, it's faster remixing because social media gets better over time. The creative tools get better. And of course, a lot of this material is quite political in nature, right? But a lot of it also is situated in the realm of parody and satire. It's hard to unpack what's going on in many cases if you can't interpret the message clearly. Generative art communities, now thanks to AI, we're starting to see, right, a pivot away from the more manual editing of Photoshop to more automated editing. For instance, you can take, again, an original piece of art or a photograph or a video, what have you, process it through a generative model, something like a generative adversarial network, or something like Stable Diffusion, which is becoming more popular, and just recontextualize the piece. For instance, here's an example of a girl with pearl earring being recontextualized in the style of the Netflix anime series Arcane. So we have these large fandom communities on the internet that are constantly reworking all of this older media. And so then the story is really complicated. We love the creative aspects of the internet, but we know that there's some dangerous material out there. What do we do? I believe it really comes down to the interpretation of the message. This is what Errol Morris was telling us about, right, 15 years ago. This, of course, is what Hannah Arendt was talking about when it comes to the truth. You can't just look at a piece of media in isolation and make some sort of determination on whether or not the message is true, whether or not it's something, right, that is dangerous. You have to situate it in a broader context and think about the meaning, think about where it came from, what is the provenance, and think about what actions it's meant to provoke, right, and be critical of it, most importantly. All of that is really key. You can't go around decrying all of the fake stuff on the internet because the internet is mostly fake stuff, right? In some sense, that doesn't make any sense because we're continually drawn to that space because many of us, again, love the creative aspects. So a lot of tension there. Okay, I'm going to stop here. But if you want to learn more, I have written an entire book talking about this stuff and other stuff related to fakery on the internet. It's going to be out December 5th on Stanford University Press, and you can already pre-order it on Amazon if you're interested. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
I have
Thank
a
you.
question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Please, questions, of course, Alicia.
I have a question. Thank you so much for that talk. What was the date on the drowning man, the first fake photo?
Oh, it was 1840.
1840. Do you know of Dion Boucicault's The Octoroon? It's a play, a Victorian era play. At the heart in the climactic scene, like there's a murder that is sort of putting everyone to their shifts. And Boucicault was really interested in new technologies, and so the camera is like a feature in this play. And it
Oh,
was
that's
written
interesting.
in
I'm not familiar at all about this. Okay.
yeah, it was written in 1859. And the reason that I know about it is because a contemporary playwright, Brandon Jacob Jenkins, did an adaptation of it. And it's really amazing because in the original, I was thinking about it your whole presentation, like the camera provides that photographic evidence that's needed to solve the case, right? And everyone, and it's sort of like this theme throughout that he's rich, he has this camera, everyone wants their portrait taken, and then in the climactic scene, they find the photo that solves the case. But in Brandon Jacob Jenkins' adaptation, he does a lot of really great meta work with that scene because he's like, this wouldn't have the same impact on audiences now, right? With all the technology and all, and you can fake anything. So I just thought, you know, your book is coming out, but I thought you might find it fascinating to read the original. It's a melodrama, Victorian melodrama, and then Brandon Jacobs Jenkins, he renamed it An Octoroon instead of the Octoroon, and I just think I was thinking about it your whole presentation. I think you would find
Yeah,
it
that's great. No, I'm not familiar at all with that. I'm gonna have to take a
yeah.
look at that. Because again, I'm really fascinated, especially where like the camera appears in other sort of cultural contexts, right? In
Yeah,
this early period, like how was it received?
yeah.
And again, that's really interesting. Then it was like reinterpreted as like, again, like people became more familiar with the issue of photographic manipulation.
Well,
Yeah,
I
thank you
mean,
for that.
it was just it's a great moment in the later play. I love Brandon Jacob Jenkins. I think he is like one of the big playwrights, big American playwrights right now. And he basically comes out and it's this meta moment where he's like, to Boucicault's audiences, this camera would have been this new exciting thing, and that really adds to the melodrama, but now we all have them in our pockets and whatnot, and so he ends up setting the theater on fire instead. It's great, but to create that effect, that same effect. But no, I thought it was interesting because if as early as the 1840s you said there was that fake photo, the drowning man photo, you know, it's just interesting that also even just a couple of decades later, the camera is still set up as this thing that can provide the facts that solve the case.
Yeah, yeah, and again, I'm not surprised. There was intense debate too, as these techniques for manipulating photographs come out. Like early photographers were debating the ethics of that right away. But
Mhm.
of course, the editing won out. Like no one ever stopped doing it. It was just tremendously popular with customers. But again, like this does come up because again, there's this yeah like feeling that this really should capture right some objective truth, right?
Yeah.
That's what we want. But again, the creative community is arguing no, 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 right? This is just a medium, like the paintbrush is, a medium, like the chisel is a medium, right? Like this is something that should be flexible, and again, that tension has never, been resolved.
Alicia, could you put the title in the chat?
Of course.
Peter, you have a question?
Yeah, well, it's really a comment, actually, if you don't mind.
Please.
I mean, it's about the extent of photo manipulation in science. The UK Science and Technology Committee heard evidence when one of its recent hearings, well, a couple of years ago, that in scientific papers that contain photo images, up to 25% of them have manipulated images. And sometimes the manipulation is for good reasons, it's to highlight something, but many of them are for fraud. And I mean, only last week, the Swedish National Board for Assessing Research Misconduct found that a case I'd reported to them of photo manipulation in a paper in the Lancet was upheld, and they found that the paper was fraudulent. And that paper in the Lancet, we know, has led to people having an operation that actually doesn't work. And we know, for example, that in the UK, 2 children have died, 5 people have died in Sweden, 5 or 6 in Italy, in Florence, some in America have died by surgeons trying to repeat a fraudulent operation. And I mean, the principal author of this paper is now been convicted of criminal offences in both Italy and Sweden, and is in prison in Sweden at the moment. I mean, he is a surgeon, but he manipulated images. And in fact, the reason we took it to the Swedish National Board was that the Lancet was refusing to retract the paper even after the surgeon was found to be guilty of a criminal offence in Sweden. And they were still refusing to retract the paper, where it was clear to us that the images had been manipulated. And that is what the Swedish National Board have found, for assessing research misconduct, have found. So they've said that the paper was fraudulent. And so it is actually doing quite a lot of harm in science and in medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the book, I talk a little bit about the scientific integrity question. I point out like this is a very serious problem. One issue I've noted too is the media forensics community, like that's sort of charged with creating the algorithms that can detect the manipulation. They are very obsessed with the internet, and it's been very difficult to get them to focus on the real problems like scientific integrity. Right, like the Western blot images that have been manipulated, right? There's like all this stuff that's like a serious issue, but only a handful of very good researchers are looking at that versus, right, this large army of people that are just, you know, operating in the internet space, which again, like it's this creative space. Of course, there's a lot of content there, but I feel like that effort is being misdirected, and I'd love to see it come back to again a case where there should never be any inappropriate manipulation, right? And again, very serious consequences. Again, a little bit, yeah, the contrast improvement, yeah, that is a form of manipulation, but innocent. But I don't even see good best practices in terms of scientific publication, in terms of like, this is permissible, and this is how to note it, right? So it's in some sort of metadata associated with the paper. Again, I think a lot of work needs to be done there. Absolutely, completely agree.
If I may, yeah, if I may comment, at Brain Health Alliance and in some of our work in the BHAVI program, we pay attention to language and use of vocabulary, and I think it would be extremely helpful if we could all cooperate together to establish some clear and explicit use of vocabulary that helps to differentiate. So, for example, manipulation of an image may be done for creative artistic purposes, and that's okay as long as it is represented as creative artistic work. The problem becomes when there is a lack of transparency about the manipulation of the photographic image in science that then leads to the result with actual deaths of patients in hospitals. So what language can we use to differentiate between manipulation of images for creative artistic purposes in contrast to manipulation of images for deception and fraud? So I do think we have to develop some language, and hopefully our Shakespearean classicist English professor can help us develop some vocabulary here. But the key word here is deception. When the image is manipulated for creative artistic purposes without deception, maybe we can call that okay. On the other hand, when it is done with deception and fraud and results in harm and deaths to people, we have to call that not okay. How do we develop vocabulary to make clear the differences? Now, let me turn to Kobe. Kobe has a comment or question.
Yeah, it's sort of part comment, part question, and part bit of an aside that is, I think, directly related. So I think that, and throughout the entire time I was listening, I had a slightly different perspective. I have a sort of side hobby passion of anthropology and symbols. And, you know, I think there's a very long history of symbols and whether religious or cultural or whatever being completely taken, appropriated, warped into meaning completely different things. And I think that there's a significant amount of similarity here, where, you know, you're taking something which has some sort of significance. In the case of a photo image, it's supposed to signify some sort of truth, and you're warping it to mean something else. In the world of anthropology and symbols, you're taking some sort of icon that has some sort of significance and warping it. The first two that come to mind, more recently, I mean, you mentioned Pepe the Frog. I understand that the artist who originally made Pepe the Frog never intended for any of these sort of hateful memes to come out from it.
reworked in a bad context. Yeah.
Exactly, and also as some sort of side interest to me, I mean, of course, there's the long history of the Nazi regime taking symbols and completely warping it. Most famously, of course, the swastika, which was originally a symbol of the sun, of luck, of prosperity, now being seen as a sort of symbol of death and hatred. And so I wonder if we shouldn't also see if we can get someone who's actually an anthropologist, who's not just me, to make some comments on this. But I guess the other question that's really more relevant here is if you have any thoughts in that area.
Yeah, in fact, I have a lot of thoughts, and I've captured some of them in this book. So the book, again, linking this to anthropology, the book develops like an explanatory theory about fakery on the internet that is deeply tied to Levi-Strauss's idea of the myth cycle, right? The book argues that the myth cycles never really went away, right? You know, it's like, sure, you have the Enlightenment, sure, right, there's a push to try to like, you know, bury this sort of, you know, storytelling, but people really love it, right? And the internet, especially like McLuhan's vision of the internet, basically accelerates it rapidly. And so again, you see again these elaborate myth cycles appearing on the internet, and all of this material being recontextualized, right, by different communities. And because the technology facilitates it, it's really, really easy. So I completely agree. I mean, yeah, you've sort of, you know, captured what I was thinking when I started to put this research together. And again, I think there's increasing interest like in anthropology, like in this phenomenon. But again, typically you don't hear about fake things like in that sort of, you know, realm, right? Because again, like it's usually like it's bad, or right, it's like I love it, I'm doing it, right? And the analysis has been kind of thin. But yeah, I think you're thinking the exact same thing I was thinking.
Thank you very much.
Other questions, comments?
I was just going to say that while the photo manipulation that's done by certain authors to promote lies within their scientific papers are lies, but a lot of the artists who were using photography as part of their art, for example, Man Ray, would manipulate his own photographs to, or manipulate your eye in looking at something in a photograph. And that's another way of manipulating how you see whatever the image is.
Yeah. I mean, again, like the photograph becomes again this like really flexible medium, which again I think a lot of people sort of underrate when they think about photography today. Again, like creatives really pivot to it almost immediately in the 19th century, and again that innovation has not stopped, right? This is what we continually see with new algorithmic ways to manipulate visual media.
I will offer one final perspective, which we must also include in a differential discussion of how we develop words and vocabulary. And that is, of course, the intellectual property perspective for artists and their copyrights on their creative works, whether it's a sculpture, whether it's a oil painting, whether it's a photograph. These are three completely different considerations that we must keep in mind when addressing manipulation of anything. Is it done with good intent for creative artistic purposes? Okay. How do we protect the financial income and way to earn a living for that creative artist or that creative photographer without other people stealing and making money off of that work to the detriment of the creative artist? So there are a couple of different perspectives here, and I think there's an awful lot of both scholarly work, frankly, engineering work, as well as important legal work. So we must also involve the legal community to help assure protections of creative artists, creative scholars, to differentiate between these different kinds of manipulations, regardless of whether it's done with an old-fashioned camera that actually has a film negative, or whether it's done with digital manipulation in Adobe Photoshop or any other computer environment. So hopefully this can get solved in the coming years, but it will also necessarily involve contributions from the lawyers in the legal community to assure that musicians and painters and photographers and artists can have their rights protected as well.
And people, so that humans aren't betrayed by scientific publications that really
Absolutely.
are lying to the reader and falsely betray a surgical procedure, a Western blot, a gel, something else, and that being used to make or break a scientific career. That's the Baltimore story. Was there were false images put into papers that he was senior author on, and he never looked at the actual papers to review the data points or the things that were being presented, or at least that's what he claims. And he says to have never known that the images were falsified. So,
well, I will close this session with one final remark that perhaps considers the appeal for what can be either called metadata or watermarking. I actually believe that maybe the only way to protect rights as well as public health and safety will be to mandate, to require that we have metadata and or watermarking of some kind or another embedded in association with the image, regardless of whether it's scientific or creative and artistic. But if we can devise effective means to maintain metadata associated with the photograph and or some kind of hidden, invisible watermark, then hopefully we can protect both public health and safety in the scientific medical literature, as well as the rights of creative artists. So with that, let's close this talk, and we'll take a few minutes break so that I can stop this recording and then restart the next one. Alicia, if you're okay with us restarting at 11:30 California time in 5 minutes, we will open the next talk at 11:30. Thank you, everybody.
and thank you, Walter.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Appreciate
and
it.
fabulous discussion. I really appreciate your presentation and your talk. Just fabulous, Walter. Fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.